A man, half buried in the snow, lips frozen blue, his hand still clutching a torn saddlebag, as if something inside held a secret strong enough to keep him alive. And through that storm, fierce enough to swallow a man's final breath, a widow stepped outside, lantern in hand. And in that trembling light, everything began to change. Stay with me for just one more minute. I'll tell you the story of that night when compassion was lit in the heart of a blizzard, and two lost souls found their way home by the same small light. If stories like this still warm your heart on cold nights, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next light that shines through the dark. May that little lantern find its way to you, wherever you are. It was the kind of winter that silenced even memory, where the wind carried no song, and the world seemed carved from ice and sorrow. The pines around Hollow Creek bent under the weight of snow, their branches groaning like tired men shouldering grief. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the frozen hills that stretched for miles, each one ghostly and still, beneath a sun that had long forgotten warmth. In that quiet expanse stood a single cabin, small, wooden, and worn by years of weather, its chimney breathing faint wisps of smoke into the silver air, as if fighting to prove there was still life inside. Within its walls sat Eleanor Ward, a widow of 52, slender and pale, her auburn hair streaked with silver, her hands roughened from winters spent alone. She wore a gray wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the same one her husband had given her on their last Christmas together. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, restless shadows across the wooden floor, and the only light came from a lantern resting on the table beside her. A lantern she had kept lit every night since the day Samuel died. Sometimes she would whisper to that flame, as though it might carry her words to wherever he had gone. Tonight, though, she said nothing. She only listened to the slow crackle of the fire and the long sigh of the wind against the windows. Across the room sat an empty chair, old carved oak, its arms worn smooth by years of use. Samuel's chair. He had mended his boots there, humming low hymns that wandered through the cabin like soft prayers. She could almost hear him still, that half-tune about mercy and grace, though it came now only as an echo that faded before it reached her heart. 3 winters had passed since the fever took him, and still she could not bear to move that chair. To do so felt like closing a door she wasn't ready to lock. Outside, snow began to fall again, drifting like dust over the fields. Eleanor rose slowly, pulling her shawl tighter, and stepped toward the door. She needed more wood before the night deepened. The stack by the hearth was nearly gone. The cold hit her like a wall the moment she opened the door, sharp, merciless, and alive. The wind bit at her cheeks, stinging her eyes until tears came unbidden. She trudged through the snow toward the barn, her boots sinking into the soft white, each step leaving a hollow imprint that the storm would soon erase. Halfway to the barn, she stopped. Something, or someone, was lying near the edge of the trail, half hidden beneath a crust of ice and snow. At first, she thought it might be a fallen deer, but then the lantern's light caught on fabric. Dark wool, torn at the shoulder, the faint outline of a man's hand reaching toward nothing. Her breath caught in her throat. He lay on his side, his face turned upward, pale as the snow around him, his lashes crusted with frost, his lips tinted the color of dusk. His body was still, except for the faintest shiver that trembled through him like a dying flame. Beside him lay a saddlebag, torn, frozen stiff, one strap buried deep in the snow, as though he'd been clinging to it when he fell. It looked almost empty, but something about the way his fingers curled around it, fierce and desperate, made Eleanor hesitate. The air seemed to still around her, the wind dropping into a whisper, as if the whole night waited to see what she would do. She could have turned away. There was fear in her bones, not the kind that screams, but the quiet kind that grows after years of loss, whispering, "You've given enough, Eleanor. Let the world take care of its own." But then she remembered her husband's words on his final night, spoken between ragged breaths. If ever someone knocks in the cold, don't turn them away. The Lord tests hearts that way. Her lantern wavered in the wind as she knelt beside the stranger. His pulse was faint, his breath shallow, each exhale forming fragile clouds that vanished into the night. She touched his shoulder, feeling the stiffness of his coat, the ice clinging to his hair. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, but the only answer was the distant howl of the storm. It took every ounce of strength she had to drag him through the snow, her boots slipping, her arms trembling beneath the weight. Twice she nearly fell, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand, scattering light across the white emptiness. When she reached the porch, she kicked the door open and pulled him inside, gasping as the warmth of the room wrapped around them both like a mercy. She laid him near the hearth and threw another log onto the fire, sparks leaping like startled birds. Then she covered him with quilts, the thick ones she'd saved for the coldest nights, and hurried to the kitchen shelf. There was little left, a few carrots, a heel of bread, and a single bowl of broth she'd been saving for morning. She warmed it over the flame, watching the steam rise, then spooned it gently between his lips. Most of it spilled down his chin, but a few drops went in, and he swallowed weakly. When the firelight reached his face, Eleanor saw he wasn't much older than 40. His jaw was rough with frost-bitten stubble, a scar ran along his temple, and his hair, dark with streaks of gray, clung wet to his forehead. His hands were calloused, his nails cracked, the kind of hands that belonged to a man who worked the land or rode long miles through the wilderness. Hours passed before he stirred. The storm outside had softened to a low hum, the wind brushing against the cabin walls like a sigh. The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes pale blue, dazed and unfocused. His voice came out as a rasp, barely a breath. "Do I know this place?" Eleanor sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She studied his face, the confusion written there, the tremor in his voice that sounded less from cold than from something deeper, fear, maybe, or loss. Her voice was steady when she answered, soft enough to feel like part of the firelight itself. "No," she said gently, "but maybe it knows you." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the crackle of the fire filled the silence, mingling with the faint drip of melting ice from the roof. The man's breathing slowed, his eyes closing again, and Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze falling to the lantern still burning beside them. Its glow trembled across the room, painting golden ripples on the walls, a light that seemed too small for the vast dark beyond, yet stubborn enough to remain. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a whisper of thaw, a promise, fragile and far. Inside, the widow of Hollow Creek sat watching the flame that refused to die, the stranger's shallow breaths keeping rhythm with the storm. And somewhere between that sound and the silence that followed, something unseen began to stir, like the first breath of spring beneath a field of snow. By morning, the storm had gentled into a slow whisper, and the light that crept through the frosted windows was thin and gray, like the first cautious breath after a night too long. Eleanor sat by the hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, eyes fixed on the stranger lying beneath her old patchwork quilts. The man stirred, his breath steady now, though his face was pale and worn, as if life had only half returned. When he opened his eyes, they were the color of winter sky, not empty but far away, as though they searched for something beyond the walls, beyond the morning, beyond memory itself. He tried to sit up, his hand pressed against his side, his voice rough like dry wind scraping stone. "Where am I?" The words came haltingly, and Eleanor, calm yet cautious, answered softly, "Hollow Creek, my home." He blinked slowly, as if the name should mean something, but did not. His gaze drifted to the lantern, still burning faintly on the table. "I don't remember," he whispered. "Not this place. Not anything. Not even who I am." His eyes clouded, fear glinting in them like ice breaking underfoot. She noticed the gold ring on his left hand, thin, scuffed, its inscription worn smooth except for two faint letters, HG. She turned it gently in the light, her brow furrowed. "Then we'll start with this," she said quietly. "A ring is a promise, even when the memory of it is gone." When she asked if he recalled his name, he shook his head. So she gave him one to hold on to, simple and strong, like a thread between strangers. "Henry," she said. "It'll do until the real one comes back." The man tested the name under his breath, his lips barely moving. Henry. It sounded uncertain, yet right enough to stay. The way he looked at her then, with gratitude and quiet disbelief, reminded Eleanor of how her late husband once looked at her the day they first met, like someone recognizing kindness he no longer believed existed. That afternoon, the sun pushed weakly through the clouds, glinting off the snow piled against the porch. Henry, though still weak, insisted on standing. "I won't just take your mercy," he said, steadying himself against the table. "If I'm still breathing, I ought to earn it." His voice was hoarse, but carried the tone of a man used to working with his hands. A voice that didn't ask for pity. Eleanor tried to protest, but something in his expression, quiet, resolute, reminded her that allowing him to help might be its own kind of healing. So she led him outside, wrapped in one of Samuel's old coats, and watched as he took up the axe by the woodpile. The sound of chopping echoed across the valley, sharp against the stillness. He swung carefully at first, then with more rhythm, each strike sending shivers through the frost-heavy air. There was grace in the motion, hesitant, uncertain, yet familiar, like a song half-remembered. "You've done this before," Eleanor remarked quietly from the porch. Henry paused, his breath forming pale clouds. "Maybe," he said, staring at his gloved hands. "It feels like something I once knew." He split another log clean through and stood there a while, staring at the grain, lost in a thought that wouldn't come clear. As the days stretched, their rhythm found shape again, slow, measured, and gentle. Henry mended the fence behind the barn with tools so old they seemed ready to crumble, yet his fingers moved as though they remembered the weight of nails, the turn of a wrench, the way wood should sound when whole again. Eleanor watched from the window, a quiet ache in her chest she couldn't name, not pity, not affection, but a strange recognition of someone else learning to begin again. In the evenings, they shared supper at the wooden table, stew thinned by water, bread hard at the edges, and spoke little. But silence, in that small cabin, no longer felt so empty. One night, as the wind whispered through the chimney, Eleanor took out her husband's old Bible. Its leather cover had cracked with time, its pages soft and yellowed like worn cloth. She opened it by instinct to the same passage she'd read since Samuel's passing, the one about the shepherd who left his flock to find the one that was lost. Her voice was low and steady as she read, the words filling the room with the kind of peace that doesn't comfort so much as remind. Henry sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, eyes following the firelight rather than the page. When she reached the verse, "For the lost shall be found, and the broken made whole," he turned his gaze to the floor, his jaw tightening, a flicker of something unspoken shadowing his face. "You don't have to listen if it troubles you," Eleanor said gently, closing the Bible halfway. But Henry shook his head. "It doesn't trouble me," he murmured. "It just feels familiar, like I've heard it before, somewhere I can't place." His fingers brushed against the golden ring, and for a moment he looked as if he might remember. Then the thought slipped away, leaving only the hollow ache of almost. Later, when she rose to fetch more firewood, Henry's eyes wandered across the mantel, over the old clock that no longer ticked, the framed photograph propped beside it. It was a black and white portrait, slightly faded, of a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a weathered face, dressed in a wool coat. Samuel Ward. Henry froze, his breath catching in his throat. The firelight seemed to waver as he leaned closer, his expression tightening. "This man," he whispered. "I've seen him before." Eleanor turned, startled by the tremor in his voice. "What did you say?" Henry didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the photograph, the muscles in his jaw working, his hand trembling slightly, as if the memory pressing at the edge of his mind was too heavy to hold. "I don't know where," he said finally, voice breaking, "but I know that face. I've seen him. Maybe not in this life, but somewhere." The way he said it, not as confusion, but as certainty, sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Eleanor forced a faint smile, half to comfort him, half to steady herself. "You've been through much, Henry. Perhaps your mind's playing tricks." But even as she spoke, she felt something stir, a small, stubborn spark of curiosity she couldn't quiet. The photograph gleamed softly in the lantern light, Samuel's eyes seeming almost alive within the frame, watching, waiting. Henry turned away at last, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of exhaustion, and sank back into the chair beside the fire. Eleanor stood for a while longer, her hand resting on the mantel, her heart caught between disbelief and a faint, uneasy hope. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, softer this time, flakes drifting like feathers, slow and soundless. Inside, the lantern flame danced, its glow spilling over two faces marked by loss and questions unspoken, and though neither of them said another word, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the kind that holds its breath, waiting for the truth to return. The days lengthened, and the sharpness of winter softened into the pale quiet of early spring. The snow no longer fell in heavy veils, but melted into shallow rivulets that cut through the fields like silver scars. Eleanor could feel the season changing by the sound of the creek outside. Less a whisper now, more a voice, rising again after months of silence. Yet inside the cabin, something else stirred too. Not renewal, but unrest. Henry had grown stronger, color had returned to his cheeks, the weight of sickness replaced by a restless energy that neither work nor prayer could calm. He began to walk the valley alone at dusk, staring toward the horizon as if it hid the answer to a question that had followed him home from the storm. At night, Eleanor would sometimes wake to the creak of the floorboards. Through the faint light of the dying fire, she'd see Henry seated at the table, hands pressed against his temples, whispering to himself. The words came broken, like the remnants of a dream already fading. Coal, Briar Ridge, Silver Brand. The names meant nothing to her, yet there was something in the way he said them. The pain, the longing, that filled the room with a chill deeper than winter itself. When she asked him once what they were, he only shook his head. "I don't know," he said softly. "They come to me like ghosts, and every time I reach for them, they vanish." By daylight, he returned to his chores, chopping wood, patching the barn door, feeding the horse Eleanor had borrowed from a neighbor. But there was a distance in him now, a searching that no task could bury. Eleanor watched quietly, torn between worry and compassion. She'd grown used to his presence, the sound of his boots on the porch, his quiet humming when he thought no one could hear. The man who had once arrived half dead in her arms was now filling the house again with something that resembled life. And yet, behind his calm voice, she sensed a storm still brewing. One afternoon, with the air thick with the scent of thawing pine, Eleanor made her way into Hollow Creek's small general store, a dim, crowded place lined with barrels of grain, bolts of cloth, and gossip thick as dust. She went to trade the last of her preserves for coffee and lamp oil. The stove in the corner hissed quietly, and two cowboys sat nearby, boots crossed, talking in low, weathered voices. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his jaw, was reading from a worn newspaper. "Still no sign of him," he said, tapping the page. "Harrison Grady, owner of Silver Brand Ranch down south, fell from his horse near the river 3 months back. Horse made it home without him. They say the man was as good as gone." Eleanor froze where she stood. The air seemed to thin around her, the name echoing like a bell inside her chest. Silver Brand. She had heard that name before, in Henry's restless murmurs, spoken half in sleep. Her heart quickened. She set the jar of preserves on the counter without a word and slipped out into the street, the sound of the men's laughter fading behind her. The cold wind met her face as she hurried down the dirt road, past the shuttered houses and the church, whose steeple cut through the pale sky like a blade of light. When she reached the cabin, the sun was sinking low, pouring a dull gold through the window panes. Henry stood by the stove, sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot of stew that filled the air with the scent of thyme and smoke. He looked peaceful in that moment, almost ordinary. And Eleanor hesitated at the door, the poster clutched tight in her trembling hands. She thought of all the quiet mornings they'd shared, the way his eyes softened when she read aloud from Samuel's Bible, the way he'd begun to hum again, as if rediscovering music itself. She thought of losing all that, of the silence returning, but truth, she knew, had its own mercy, even when it hurt. She stepped inside without speaking, the boards creaking under her boots. Henry turned, smiling faintly, until he saw her face. She laid the folded paper on the table. "They were talking about a man," she said quietly. "A ranch owner from the South, Harrison Grady." The name seemed to linger in the air, heavier than smoke. Henry's brow furrowed. He wiped his hands on a cloth and reached for the page. The poster was worn from passing hands, a simple sketch of a man's face beneath the words "missing," reward offered by the Grady family. His eyes moved over the image, then down to the name scrawled in ink. For a moment, he said nothing. The fire crackled in the silence, a single ember falling like a star. Then, slowly, Henry's breath hitched. "That's me," he whispered, his voice raw, disbelieving. "I remember now. The horse, the fall, the river." His hand rose to his temple as though the memory had struck him like a blow. His eyes flickered, confusion, pain, and a strange kind of awe. He staggered back a step, gripping the edge of the table. "I was riding along the ridge. Cole was there, my foreman. We were driving cattle down to the valley when the storm hit. The horse slipped. I remember the river, cold as death. I thought I—" His voice broke, the words swallowed by a tremor that ran through him. Eleanor crossed the room in silence, her heart aching at the sight of him. This man who had come to her door as a stranger and now stood before her, stripped bare of everything but the truth. She reached out, resting her hand lightly on his arm. "Then, it seems," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray the weight of her own heart, "you've found your way home twice, Henry. Once to memory, and once to mercy." He looked at her then, not as a man remembering his past, but as someone seeing his own soul reflected in another's kindness. His eyes glistened in the lamplight, the ring on his finger catching a faint glow as he lifted his hand to his face. "I should have died out there," he murmured, almost to himself. "But maybe that fall wasn't meant to end me. Maybe it was meant to bring me here." The words hung between them, fragile, honest, and alive. Eleanor said nothing. She only smiled, a small, weary smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. The hollow inside her chest, that quiet ache she had carried since Samuel's passing, felt different now. Not gone, but filled with something gentler, warmer, a purpose she had not known she still possessed. Outside, the wind had died. The lantern by the window flickered softly, its light steady and golden. Henry sank back into his chair, breathing deep, as though the weight of his own name had both broken and healed him. And Eleanor, standing beside the hearth, closed her eyes for a moment, listening, not to the storm, not to grief, but to the sound of life returning. The morning they left Hollow Creek was quiet, the kind of dawn that seemed carved from glass, cold, brittle, and still. The sky was painted in faded silver and rose, and the frost clung to the wagon wheels like it didn't want to let them go. Eleanor stood by the cabin door, her hand resting against the frame for a moment longer than necessary, as though pressing a memory into the wood. Henry waited beside the wagon, his coat buttoned high, his hat pulled low to shield his face from the wind. He still looked frail, though his eyes carried a steadiness she hadn't seen before, not the strength of the body, but of someone who had finally remembered who he was. The horse snorted, steam rising from its nostrils, and when Eleanor climbed aboard, she didn't look back. Some places, she thought, aren't meant to be left with eyes, only with gratitude. The road south stretched before them like a long breath drawn through the ribs of the valley, winding through fields of frozen grass and hills brushed with mist. The wagon creaked, its wooden wheels biting into the thawing mud, and the wind whispered through the pines like a hymn without words. For hours, neither of them spoke. There was comfort in the silence, not the uneasy quiet of strangers, but the shared stillness of two people who had survived something vast and wordless. Occasionally, Henry would glance at her from the corner of his eye, as if still unsure whether the world he had woken into was real or some mercy he didn't deserve. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost lost to the wind. "I had a boy once," he said, the corners of his mouth curving into a smile that trembled between pride and ache. "Thomas, strong-willed, too smart for his own good, built fences straighter than mine before he turned 12. He paused, the reins loose in his hands, the words coming slowly as if drawn from deep water. And a wife. God, she was steady. The kind of woman who could quiet a storm just by standing in it. He let out a breath, heavy and uneven. They're all that's left of Silverbrand Ranch. Or they were. I don't even know what time's done to them. Eleanor listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't interrupt, didn't need to. The way he spoke carried its own kind of prayer. It must have been a fine place, she said quietly after a while. Henry nodded, his eyes distant. It was. Built with my own hands. Thought I was building something that would outlast me. Funny thing about that, you never realize how fragile forever sounds until you lose it. The wind tugged at his coat then, as though the world itself was reminding him that nothing stays still, not even grief. The day stretched on. They passed a frozen meadow where deer tracks crossed the snow like faint brushstrokes, then a stretch of river that wound through the rocks in dull gray ripples. The air smelled faintly of pine and earth, clean and sharp. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather, thin at first, then darkening into a low, brooding sky. Eleanor drew her shawl tighter, her breath visible as she turned toward Henry. "There's a chapel not far from here," she said. "Up along the ridge. We can stop there for the night." They reached it just as dusk began to fold over the hills. A small wooden chapel perched on a slope, its steeple leaning slightly, its windows frosted and dim. The door creaked when Henry pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold but still, carrying the faint scent of old candles and cedar. Dust floated in thin shafts of light from the stained glass window above the altar, where a single wooden cross stood, plain, unadorned, yet quietly steadfast. They settled their things near the back pew, the wagon parked just outside where the horse could rest. Eleanor lit a lantern and walked slowly toward the altar. Her footsteps echoed gently against the wooden floor, each step soft as a sigh. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small candle, its wick already worn from use. With careful hands, she lit it from the lantern's flame and placed it before the cross. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply watched the flame tremble in the draft that slipped through the chapel walls. Then she whispered, "Maybe we're both heading home, just by different roads." Henry stood a few paces behind her, his hat held in his hands. The flickering light painted his face in shades of gold and shadow, the lines of his age and sorrow softened by the glow. He stepped forward slowly, his voice low but steady. "You gave me back my name, ma'am," he said. "But more than that, you gave me a reason to live long enough to remember it." His words fell into the quiet, like stones into deep water, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor turned toward him, the flame reflected in her eyes. There was something unspoken between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The kind of bond forged not by time, but by the quiet act of saving and being saved. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the chapel's walls like the sound of an old hymn trying to find its way home. They sat for a while longer in silence, side by side in the front pew. Henry's breathing slowed, his head bowed as though in prayer, while Eleanor watched the candlelight dance across the wooden beams above them. The flame flickered, stretched, then steadied, casting a warm halo that reached their faces. Two silhouettes carved out of loss, finding shape again in the dim light of mercy. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled softly, and the first drops of rain began to fall, not cold, but cleansing. Henry reached for the ring on his finger, turning it slowly, feeling the engraving beneath his thumb. The initials HG caught the light for just a moment before the flame dimmed, and he smiled faintly. "Strange thing, life," he said. "How it brings you back to where you were meant to be, even if you don't remember asking for it." Eleanor didn't answer. She simply leaned back against the pew, her gaze fixed on the flickering flame that refused to die. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight of silence lift from her chest. When they finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the night was clear enough to see the faint shimmer of stars pushing through the clouds. Henry helped her climb back into the wagon, his movements slower but sure, and when their eyes met, Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The road ahead waited, long and uncertain, but for once it no longer felt lonely. Behind them, through the small chapel window, the candle still burned, its flame steady and bright, a tiny light in the vast dark, marking the place where two souls, lost in their own ways, had paused just long enough to be found. The rain from the ridge had passed by dawn, leaving behind a hush that seemed to bless the earth. The road wound downward through hills washed clean of dust, and the air carried the scent of wet sage and thawing soil. Henry held the reins steady, his hands no longer trembling, his gaze fixed on the horizon where light gathered low and golden. Beside him, Eleanor watched the world unfold. Wide, unending fields stretching into a sky burnished with copper, fences standing like long, quiet lines of memory. They spoke little. After so many miles, words had become almost unnecessary. Every turn of the wheel, every creak of the wagon seemed to carry a kind of prayer, not for what they had lost, but for what still might be found. As dusk bled into evening, the land opened up like a vast ocean of grass, the horizon rippling beneath a sun that seemed reluctant to leave. The ranch appeared first as a mirage, a scatter of fences, a windmill still turning, smoke rising faintly from a chimney too far to belong to any stranger. Henry slowed the horse, his eyes narrowing, as if afraid that the place might vanish if he looked too directly at it. Then, as they drew closer, the carved wooden sign came into view, its letters worn but legible even in the fading light. Silver Brand Ranch. The sight hit him like a heartbeat remembered. He didn't speak, only swallowed hard, his breath catching on the edge of something that wasn't quite pain, but wasn't peace yet either. The ranch hands working near the barn looked up when they heard the wagon approach. Their shovels froze mid-air. A few stepped back, blinking in disbelief. Henry's figure, older, leaner, touched by frost and time, must have looked like a ghost returned from the high country. One of the men called out, his voice cracking, "Mr. Grady," but Henry couldn't answer. He only nodded once, his throat too thick with memory. The horse stopped near the porch, its breath rising in soft plumes of mist. Then the front door opened. A young man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his movements strong but uncertain, as though walking through a dream. He looked to be in his late 20s, the same sharp eyes as Henry, the same line of jaw set against the wind. His work shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his hands still rough with dirt, and yet there was something boyish in his face that no season could weather. For a moment he stood frozen, his mouth parted, eyes wide in disbelief. "Father?" he gasped, the word trembling somewhere between joy and fear. Henry climbed down slowly from the wagon, his legs stiff, his hand gripping the sideboard for balance. His voice broke as he spoke, the sound raw with gratitude. "Thomas," he whispered, "I thought I'd never see you again." He took a step forward, and that was all it took. The space between them closed in an instant, father and son colliding in an embrace that was more than reunion. It was resurrection. The ranch hands turned away quietly, hats in hand, as though witnessing a prayer answered. The evening wind stirred through the grass, carrying with it the scent of homecoming and the soft murmur of a world made right again. Eleanor stood by the wagon, her hands clasped before her. She looked away, the corners of her mouth trembling, her eyes burning with tears she hadn't meant to shed. Watching them, she felt something deep within her stir. A hollow ache she'd learned to live with, the kind of loneliness that sits quietly beside you even when the room is full. She pressed a gloved hand against her chest, as though steadying a heart that had forgotten how to swell. For years, she had carried others' stories of return, but never her own. Thomas was the first to notice her. When he pulled away from his father, wiping his sleeve across his face, his gaze followed Henry's back toward the wagon. "Who is this?" he asked softly. His tone wasn't suspicion, only curiosity, gentle and reverent, like someone approaching the truth. Henry turned, his expression softening as he looked at Eleanor. "The woman who brought me home," he said quietly, his voice steady now, though still touched by wonder. "When the world forgot I was still living." The simplicity of it hung in the air, honest and whole, needing no embellishment. Thomas's jaw tightened as he studied her. The slender figure wrapped in a plain wool coat, the streak of silver in her hair catching the last light of day. There was kindness in his eyes, and something like humility. He took off his hat and bowed his head. "Then she's family now," he said. Eleanor met his gaze and smiled, though her lips trembled. There was nothing she could add. The words had already said everything. She looked at Henry standing between them, the lamplight from the porch spilling over his face, illuminating the years and the roads that had led him here. In that moment, she understood that she had not simply saved a man, she had restored a story, a line of life that the storm had tried to erase. The ranch settled into quiet as night fell. The workers led the horse away, their boots thudding softly against the earth. From inside the house came the faint sound of a kettle on the stove, the comforting smell of stew drifting into the cool air. Henry stood beside his son on the porch, their shoulders touching, both staring into the horizon where the light was dying slow and red. Eleanor lingered a few steps back, her lantern glowing faintly at her side, the flame flickering like the heartbeat of something greater than gratitude. Thomas turned to her once more, his voice low. "You'll stay, won't you?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, then smiled, a quiet smile that held all the answers words could ruin. The stars began to appear one by one above the hills, small and stubborn against the dark, and the wind carried the faintest echo of a hymn long forgotten. Inside, the house waited, warm, lived in, filled with the sound of new beginnings. Outside, the lantern light followed Eleanor as she stepped onto the porch, its glow mingling with the last amber breath of sunset. Henry reached out a hand, not to lead her, but simply to steady her, as though this moment, this fragile, beautiful moment, deserved to be shared by touch. And as the night settled over Silverbrand Ranch, the world seemed to hold still long enough for grace to find its footing. The sky above burned with the last light of day, and beneath it, 3 figures stood, father, son, and the woman who had carried them both through the storm, each bound not by blood, but by the quiet mercy of having been found. Morning came to Silverbrand soft and golden, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself, but drifts quietly into the world. Like forgiveness after a long silence, the mist lifted from the fields, rising in pale ribbons that shimmered in the first light. The fences glistened with dew, the air was sweet with the scent of hay, and somewhere beyond the barn a rooster crowed once, as if to mark the beginning of something that had no name but peace. Inside the ranch house, Eleanor stood by the window, her hands clasped loosely before her, watching the sunlight spill across the land she had only heard about through Henry's broken memories. It was vast and beautiful, and though it did not belong to her, it felt familiar, the way grace sometimes feels when it finally finds a place to rest. She had been at Silverbrand for several days now, helping Thomas's wife with the kitchen, feeding the hens, and mending a few worn linens. The rhythm of the ranch had a calm she hadn't felt in years, a steadiness born from people who worked with their hands and believed in what the earth could give back. Yet every time she stepped out onto the porch and saw the land stretching toward the horizon, she knew her part in this story was nearing its end. She had come to return a man to his home, not to find one for herself. Still, she stayed through the week, long enough to see how laughter returned to the Grady house like spring returning to soil that had forgotten warmth. One afternoon, Thomas brought her a letter sealed in silver wax. He had been out riding along the southern fields and returned dusted with sun and sweat, his eyes bright in that way a man's eyes are when he's seen something he thought was gone forever. He handed her the envelope, smiling softly. "My father wrote this himself," he said. Said it's something that ought to be given with care. Eleanor took it, her hands trembling slightly, and broke the seal. Inside was a short note written in Henry's careful hand, words that carried the weight of both apology and affection. "You once gave me your last bowl of broth when you had nothing left. Let me now give you something too, a place where your kindness can grow." When she looked up, Thomas was still standing there, holding the reins of 2 horses, one chestnut, one dapple gray, their coats gleaming under the copper sun. "My father calls you the lantern that led him out of the storm," he said quietly. "He wants you to stay here at the ranch, to teach the widows and the workers' wives who've lost their homes, to give them a new skill, a new beginning. The old sewing house hasn't been used in years. It's yours if you'll take it." His voice was sincere, touched by reverence rather than pity. Eleanor's throat tightened. She looked past him toward the distant hills, where the wind bent the grass into waves of gold. "I don't know that I belong here," she murmured, her words barely above the breeze. Thomas smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries a truth learned too young. "Belonging," he said, "has less to do with where you come from, and more to do with where you're needed." Then he mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode off toward the southern fence, leaving her standing in the amber light with the letter pressed to her heart. That evening, as the sun began to lower, Eleanor walked out to the field, where the wild flowers had begun to bloom in shy clusters along the fence. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of sage and dust. She carried a small bundle, her few belongings wrapped neatly in a faded cloth, and turned once to look at the house. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and through the window she could see Henry seated by the hearth, his hands folded over the Bible she had once read to him by the fire in Hollow Creek. He looked older now, but lighter too, as if remembering had not only restored his mind, but redeemed something deeper within him. She thought of leaving quietly, but before she could take another step, the door opened. Henry stood there in the doorway, the lantern light spilling around him, his figure framed against the dusk. "Mrs. Ward," he called softly, his voice carrying that familiar steadiness that had once belonged to Samuel. "If you walk away now, the world will still be kind to you. But if you stay, maybe it'll be brighter for all of us." He stepped down the porch steps, his boots brushing against the grass wet with evening dew. "You gave me your mercy when I had nothing left," he continued, stopping a few paces from her. "Let me give you this, a place where that mercy can take root." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The light between them flickered, the lantern flame bending in the wind as though it too awaited her answer. Then Eleanor smiled, small, tired, but filled with that quiet conviction that belongs only to those who have known great loss and chosen to love the world anyway. She reached out her hand, and Henry took it without a word. Their fingers met not in possession, but in promise, the kind that doesn't bind, but belongs. Together they turned toward the porch, walking slowly, their shadows stretching long across the grass. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying with it the scent of rain far off in the hills. When they reached the steps, Eleanor glanced back once more toward the horizon. The lantern she had carried from Hollow Creek still hung on the porch rail, its glass warmed by the fading light. For the first time, she realized she hadn't lit it since the night she left. Yet somehow, the flame still burned, not because it waited for someone to come home, but because home had already been found. As the last of the daylight slipped beyond the ridge, the ranch fell into a peace so complete it seemed to hum. The cattle lowed softly in the pastures, the horses shifted in their stalls, and the air grew cool and quiet. Inside, Henry poured 2 cups of tea, setting one gently on the table across from his own. When Eleanor sat down, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Some stories, she thought, aren't meant to end in words, but in the stillness that follows them, in the way a heart, once broken, learns to beat differently, slower but surer. Outside, the lantern glowed steady through the night, its golden light brushing the fields and the hills beyond. And if someone had passed by the road below, they might have said it looked like a beacon, or maybe just the light of 2 souls who had once been lost and now were simply home. There are moments in life when kindness doesn't roar, it whispers. It arrives like the soft light before dawn, quiet enough to be missed, yet strong enough to change everything it touches. Sometimes it finds us when we're lost, and sometimes it finds its way through us, passing from one wounded heart to another until mercy becomes the only map that still leads home. And maybe that's all we're really here for, to help someone remember who they are, to lend a light when theirs has gone out, to walk beside them long enough for hope to find its footing again. The storms will always come, but so will the lanterns, carried by hands that still believe in warmth, even after the cold. If this story touched something in you tonight, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know the light still reaches you, wherever you are. And if stories like this still mean something to your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you'll be here when the next one finds its way home. May grace walk with you gently until we meet again.